It is amazing to be in a room full of experts. Many of these topics are not things that I cover and study, and it's great to see the connections to the things that we're working on. Thank you, Silverado. Thank you, Dimitri and Maureen. This is really terrific. I'm Zan Fishman. I work at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're a DC-based think tank, and our mission is to try to find that intersection between good policy and bipartisan policy, which there's more of than you would think. And many of the topics we've been talking about today really do fall within that focus of areas where there are good policy solutions that can be bipartisan, which should give everyone room for optimism. We're doing a lot on critical minerals. We're looking at demand side policy. We're really excited about that. This panel right here, we're going to talk about this intersection between climate and trade. And there are actually a lot of climate nerds around, and there are a lot of trade nerds around. And there's a relatively small number of climate trade nerds, and there's a shockingly high percentage of them in this room. So quickly, we got Dan Dudas. He's the staff director on the Senate Budget Committee, works for Senator Whitehouse. We've got Mike Mahoney, he's the CEO of the E-Liability Institute. We've got Kelly Milton, Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Environment and Natural Resources at USTR. And last and absolutely not least, Katrina Rourke, who's the Senior Vice President, Senior Vice President for Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council. Katrina, we're going to start with you. At CLC, you've done a lot of research comparing the emissions intensities of the goods and products that we produce in the United States compared to the emissions intensities of the goods produced in other countries. And what you found is that the U.S. production is cleaner, and you came up with a term for that. You call that the U.S. carbon advantage. Can you explain to us this carbon advantage, and why is that important and central to how we should think about this intersection between climate and trade policy?
I would be happy to. Thanks.
Lovely.
Let me start with the concept of the loophole. 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with goods that are made in one country and consumed in another. That shows you the power that trade can play in addressing greenhouse gas emissions, getting the globe on track to decarbonize. We simply have to address the carbon loophole. And so one of the tools that we're using to sort of diagnose the challenge is unpacking what relative carbon intensity of production looks like across the globe for the goods that we trade a whole lot of. And we've developed a couple of tools to use this. You can use proprietary market intelligence data to zoom in on specific sectors, or you can use sort of globally reported economic, trade, and emissions data to try and diagnose the economy worldwide. And so if we focus on that larger view, that larger data set, what we've produced in this carbon advantage line of study is evidence that the United States produces all goods and services on average with 44% fewer carbon emissions than the global average. That's a really good news story. As Jim was saying, that means American companies are adhering to stronger environmental principles. That comes with a cost, and that cost is not rewarded in the global trading system. It's hard to substantiate the benefits of making those investments to your customers. And so what we're trying to do is add clarity to how the US is actually performing in terms of carbon intensity so that we can equip policymakers to make the decisions that enable those investments domestically.
So we have a carbon advantage. But right now, we don't capitalize upon it. We don't get any benefit from it. Dan, Senator Whitehouse has been a real champion and forward-leaning leader on this climate and trade space. Can you? And you guys have introduced legislation, the Clean Competition Act. Could you talk a little bit about both why this topic is important to your boss and tell us about what your bill does?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I'd be happy to do that. So the senator has been interested in climate for really, since probably the 1980s. He is somebody who thinks it really is the crisis of our time. We certainly are seeing the effects of that around the country, around the world, even close to where we're sitting here today. So he has introduced a series of bills. He's also someone who has tried to seek out bipartisan consensus. And in his view, the Republican Party has generally been a fan of market solutions. And so for the last 10 years, he has introduced a series of carbon pricing bills. All of those bills have included a carbon border adjustment in them, precisely to get at what Katrina was talking about, that we have this huge percentage of our emissions that are traded. And it doesn't really make sense to just cover the domestic ones. It's creating a huge loophole. So more recently, he decided to introduce, having gotten, unfortunately, not very far on the broader theory of everything, carbon pricing bills, he introduced the Clean Competition Act, which essentially looks at what are the, and EPA actually has quite good data on this domestically, what are the industries that contribute the most to greenhouse gas emissions? And then essentially looking at those industries and creating baselines as to what is the average facility level intensity of each industry. And there's an option, given that some industries are rather heterogeneous in terms of production processes or even products, there's an option to create product level facility carbon intensities. Once you have that baseline intensity, that sets the level for a tariff, but also for a domestic, and you can call this partial carbon fee, you can call it clean product standard, you could call it a lot of things, but essentially, let's say the initial baseline intensity for steel production is 1 ton of CO2 per ton of steel produced. Then you look at what's happening in other countries. And it basically divides countries, I should say, into 3 groups. The first group is least developed countries where we don't apply it to them for a variety of reasons. The second group would be countries, and this would be our executive branch friends would get to make this determination, where there is transparent, reliable data. So, think of the EU, USMCA, Japan, Korea, probably others. The data exists, presumably, we trust it. And if you're a facility that is, and it's actually done at the company level for imports to avoid resource shuffling, but if you're a company and you're exporting to the US, we look at what your average is. If it is above that baseline, you pay based on the overage. If it's below, you pay nothing. And then there's the third bucket of countries where there is not that transparent, reliable data. So probably think China, Russia, I'm sure there's some others. For those countries, we don't want to get into the data game of trying to trust people's data and analyze it or verify it. So we just say we're going to use the economy-wide carbon intensity ratio. So right now for the US and China, it's about 3 to 1. So if it's 1 to 1, 1 ton of CO2 for 1 ton of steel in the US, we're going to assign Chinese steel 3, and so they will pay on 2 tons. Now, because we want this to be good environmental policy, over time, that initial baseline set to the US average ratchets down initially by 2.5 percentage points a year, and then by 5 percentage points a year. And after 23 years, then you're essentially paying full freight. So that's a summary of how it works. And given that it would cover a lot of things that are traded, I should also say we don't just cover the primary goods. There is an implementation process to cover goods eventually like cars, washing machines that have by weight large amounts of steel, aluminum, glass, what have you, that would be covered otherwise.
Terrific. And so you guys have introduced this legislation. It's based on an emissions performance standard. At BPC, we've written a paper on why we think basing border carbon policy on an emissions performance standard is a really good idea. We've got another paper coming out, hopefully later this month, on all the design choices you need to make. Once you've decided on that big factor, how do you design it well? Senator Cassidy has also introduced a bill that's based on an emissions performance standard. It's got some differences. We might talk about that a little bit later. But as you're thinking through designing legislation, creating a trade mechanic for monetizing that carbon advantage, you realize pretty quickly there's a bunch of questions that you have to answer, and some of them are a little difficult. How do you set the standard? You got to figure that out. How do you set the fee? What do you do about least developed countries? How are you thinking about international partnerships and trade relationships with allies? What are the incentives for individual countries? What are the incentives for individual companies? What are the incentives for domestic producers? And it goes on and on and on. Mike, one of the things you have to eventually figure out is, how do you do the accounting? How does the math all work so that we know what the numbers are? You're at the E-Liability Institute. What is e-liability, and why is it important here?
Well, Zan, first, I'm not going to answer all of those questions that you posed that policymakers are grappling with. I would like to contribute three things to the panel briefly. I'll get to your question, what is e-liability last? I want to start with, how does climate, trade, and accounting, what is the overlap there? I don't quite get that. And have we learned anything, or do we observe anything from what has happened in the EU from their implementation of CBAM? And we have, at least from our accounting perspective. Then I'll answer, so what is e-liability, very briefly. So when you think about a border adjustment mechanism, there are sort of two things in play. One is, what is the taxable basis for the emissions for that product that is being imported? How much emissions went into that kilogram of steel? One approach would be, well, we'll just take the country average emission, or we could say the average emission for a particular company. That's one way. It's not typically a taxable basis. If you think about in financial accounting, we say that we should have a set of accounting rules that are followed internationally that say this is what defines revenue, this is what defines profit, and then policymakers can say, well, this is how much we're going to tax you on that basis. Follow the same logic. We can be accounting for carbon in a similar way. And that's really where this intersects with trade policy, making sure that there's a fair, equitable, comparable way to say, what does each entity have to report in terms of its carbon intensity of its products. The second thing that we've seen in CBAM in Europe is that without this kind of approach, they run into some real problems. The first challenge that they're finding is that they have defined what they include and what they don't include in the product's emissions in a way that's really not comprehensive. So if you're a steel maker, then they want you to include the emissions that you directly emit. If you purchase other materials that are covered under CBAM, you ought to include the emissions incorporated with those, but you don't include the emissions for transportation. You don't include the emissions that other things that went into both the direct and indirect cost for manufacturing that. The second issue that we run into is this problem with using industry averages. If I'm a US company and I have a competitive advantage because I can produce that steel at a lower amount of emissions, what's my incentive to do so if I'm going to be taxed at the industry average rate? And in fact, if you're a less efficient producer, let's say in China, that is producing that same kilogram of steel for many more emissions, this average idea works out pretty good unless you take policy steps to make sure that that's equated. So we have a potential solution or a potential approach. E-liability is a concept developed by two professors, Professor Karthik Ramana at University of Oxford and Bob Kaplan at Harvard Business School. They're two accounting professors, and they said, why can't we do financial accounting for carbon? We already know how to do financial accounting. We just have to think about it slightly differently. So a couple of key principles. One, when you're thinking about the emissions related to a particular product, you have to count all emissions that you directly produced and all emissions that you directly purchased. So all the emissions for all materials and services from all of your tier 1 suppliers. You don't have to try to estimate the entire thing back to the mine, just what you directly produced. Second, all emissions have to be fully allocated to your output. So when you take that kilogram of steel and make it into a new product, you can now measure what was the embodied carbon for that product. It's at the product level that the emissions data flows through the value chain. That's a key difference. It's also imperative that we move as much as possible to primary and actual emissions data and away from the averages so that we unlock market competition, that companies that are doing well get recognized for that. So that's a very brief introduction to e-liability. I'm happy to talk more, but I don't think that would be welcome.
That's great. No, and that's good. Concise answers, terrific, because we've got 4 experts and we've got dwindling time. Time's not on our side here. So we've got our climate nerds, we've got our trade nerds, now we've got our accounting nerds. With our powers combined, we moved to Kelly. So recently, USTR sent a communication to our WTO partners titled, Understanding the Opportunities and Challenges of the Green Transition, Coherence and Interoperability of Trade-Related Climate Measures. Can you talk to us, what are you trying to achieve with this message, and how are initial meetings in Geneva from a few weeks ago? How's that going?
So discussions around trade and climate have actually been percolating and happening for a while, but they really are accelerating these days. And this really comes from the fact that countries are in fact rolling out these carbon border adjustment measures. They're doing the background work, having public consultations on what these measures might look like. We have clean energy incentives that we're rolling out. So a lot is happening in this space, and a lot of it is trade related. And of course, we see the World Trade Organization also actively engaging in this space. The Secretariat, the Director General, really impassioned about these issues. There was the first ever trade day at the most recent climate COP, COP28. And so we thought that now is the time really to put forward a communication that is in fact about climate and trade and the green transition, and really try to steer the conversations in the WTO amongst these countries, and how we can make that conversation be productive. There's so much work going on across countries in multiple organizations. The WTO has a role to play. It's an important forum for discussions amongst a wide range of countries that have very different priorities and very different domestic constituencies. But we do see a role to play. We have the observation that countries are already taking a lot of trade-related climate measures. I mentioned border adjustments, I mentioned clean energy incentives. There's a lot coming out. There's a lot more coming down the pike. And given the diversity of needs, the policy environments, the domestic constituencies, these measures and these approaches will not be the same. And so we have an opportunity, as the policies are still under development, as they're being implemented, as they're evolving, to engage with each other on these policies and how they can work together, both at the policy level, so to try to strive towards coherence, to at least make sure we're not undermining climate goals, but also in specific areas as we're considering things like embodied emissions in products. And so we use the term in our communication to the WTO about interoperability. And here we're trying to recognize that there are different approaches, but they can, in some ways, have coherence. They can ensure that we're working towards the same objectives. So we had some meetings last week in Geneva. They actually went better than I think we expected, better than we anticipated. There's certainly a recognition amongst WTO members on the need to have these conversations. I think there's also a recognition that, it's easy to say you want to have the discussions, but actually diving deeply into them will be challenging, and we recognize that. But they are important discussions to have. And so, I think we also recognize that the WTO isn't the only place that we're engaged in these conversations, and we certainly also don't want to be duplicative and just kind of repeat the same conversations over and over again. So we're thinking about that too.
Terrific. So initial meetings exceed expectations. I love that. That's great. And I like that you're focusing on the coherence and interoperability. Like that's just so pragmatic, right? there's so many people who are like, how are we going to make sure that we're doing the same thing as all of our allies, right? That's going to take a long time, if it's even possible, right? Just how can we do things each in our own ways that work together, right? I love that pragmatism of the goal. Mike, coming back to you, you talk about the accounting of it, and it just makes so much sense, right? You're like, it's like financial accounting. There's a system for it. Everybody understands it. Everybody accepts it. We don't have that same thing for tracking emissions, and it's different than measuring emissions, and it's different than reporting emissions. It's the accounting of it. Like, how do you have your ledger and your bookkeeping that makes sense? But as whenever I hear you talk about it, I always think about, oh my God, like how are we going to get everyone to start doing this, right? There are so many different entities that would need to learn and do this, and it seems like this monumental task. But you've already started, right? You've got companies that are piloting this and starting to think this way, and once a company starts doing it successfully, then people start following along. So how are those pilots going?
Let me tell you a couple stories. The first is the first pilot that we did with GT Tire in Indonesia. The CEO had attended a G20 summit where Professor Romano was speaking and said, we're going to be the first ones to do this in the world, and turned to one of her executives and said, now go do this. And the poor executive turned to us and said, what am I supposed to do? There are 150 inputs that go into making a standard passenger car tire. How do I get started? We said, look, just 80-20 rule. The professors called it the Willie Sutton rule. They asked Willie Sutton when they caught him, he's a famous bank robber, why do you rob banks? And they said, well, that's because that's where the money is. So we look for where is the carbon to get the process started. So in GT's case, they said we'll work with rubber, carbon black, steel, and synthetic resins. They went out to 4 of their suppliers, they estimate about 86% of the embodied carbon in their tire in terms of the inputs. 3 of the 4 said, yeah, we'll work with you on that. And the 3 that said that we'll work with you on that said, why are you asking? Like, you always ask about cost, maybe quality, maybe on-time delivery. Why are you asking about the embodied emissions in my rubber? Oh, well, we're going to create the first e-liability for a standard passenger car tire, and our customer, BMW, is kind of interested in this. And they said, oh, well, really glad that you asked, because it turns out in 3 of those suppliers, they had already developed some plans to reduce their emissions. They were sort of on the shelf for the most part. But they had never heard from GT that they were interested in lower emissions. Oh, okay. Within 9 months, between what GT suppliers did and what GT itself did to reduce emissions at its own plant, they were able to demonstrate to their customer, BMW, here's a standard passenger car tire that's 26% lower embodied carbon. BMW said, that's great. Oh, by the way, this is auditable, the way that you can audit a financial statement. BMW said, that's really great. There's only one problem. You source us from your Shanghai plant. So we're now in the process of doing an e-liability pilot in Shanghai with 12 of their suppliers, and it's going quite well. Let me give you a second story about Tata Steel. So Tata Steel...
Let's make this one quick.
The end was that they have found what they thought was going to be a low carbon process so there are different ways you can make steel. Blast furnaces are actually lower emissions when you do the full allocation of all of the emissions. That surprised them. They believe that this is going to be how they will be able to sell, they will be able to decommoditize what is otherwise a commodity steel by being able to show their customers this is auditable. And you sure can bet that they're going to be wanting this e-liability approach to show this is how their steel is cleaner than the average Indian steel.
All right, so one of the reasons why this border carbon policy idea is so bipartisan is you can really actually achieve a bunch of goals all at the same time, right? There's the geopolitical angle that Maureen really framed for us at the beginning of the day. There's There's supply chain security, which we've heard in a few other areas. There's domestic manufacturing and economic benefits. And when people start thinking about, and obviously I didn't even mention the climate benefits, right? We've done a bunch in the U.S. to set us on a path to decarbonization. But if the U.S. gets to zero emissions and the rest of the world doesn't, we've achieved nothing, right? Global emissions, that's what matters. So, but when people start hearing about the protecting domestic manufacturing and monetizing the carbon advantage in a way that helps U.S. manufacturing, all of a sudden people hear this little alarm bell in their head and they're like, wait, what about the WTO? So Katrina and Kelly, this is coming to each of you. The World Trade Organization, right? Are these kinds of policies compatible with WTO requirements? Katrina, at CLC, you guys published a paper looking at whether or not several different types of border carbon designs would be compatible with the WTO, and your conclusion was that they are. Can you just give us a sense of what you were looking at and how those conclusions can inform our discussion about policymaking?
Yeah, so I'm not a trade lawyer, bear with me. We hear this a lot, the WTO is going to shut these policies down, there's no way that we can implement these approaches without risking huge trade fights, it's not worth the effort. And so we've conducted some legal analysis, and by we, I'm being generous, I didn't do it, but we have a trade lawyer on staff, Matt Porterfield, who's a really creative guy, and what he identified was several pathways through the existing rule set that we can sort of leverage towards these new approaches for climate and trade. So one, you can walk through the front door, you can abide by the policies to a T. For that, you would need to design a domestic carbon price that's the same as what you apply at the border. You have to give everybody equal treatment. We can design a policy that way. It's just quite a steep sort of political hill to climb domestically to achieve that policy outcome. And then there are three exceptions that we might leverage that create some space for policies that aren't perfect, as I just described. And those exceptions include the general exceptions to care about environmental outcomes, right? You can design policies that are not sort of perfectly fair in terms of trade treatment. If we're using them to achieve really important environmental outcomes, we have used these policies before to limited success, but it's exactly what the European Union is using to justify a policy that they are implementing at present, the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That's a pathway we can leverage. There's a second pathway, somewhat controversial, called the essential security exception. If there's a crisis in international relations, then you can adopt trade policies that help you address that crisis. The essential security exception has been getting a lot of work in recent years. I don't know if that's something that you want to talk about, but it's a pretty interesting pathway because once you establish, no, you don't want to take that one up. Once you establish that there is this crisis in international relations, the U.S. at least believes at present, and I think many of our partners also do, because it sure would be nice if it's true, that then the policies that you get to implement after that, as long as they're addressing that crisis in international relations, that can be self-judging. I've done this well. And then there's a third category, which I think is the most interesting, which is to revive a policy that we used to enter into with trade partners to help us manage trade in commodities, to stabilize prices and trade flows, and make sure that we're conferring economic benefits for consumer and producer nations. It's called intergovernmental commodity agreements. Many of the products that we care most about when we talk about the energy transition, when we talk about carbon-intensive production, are commodities. Think steel, aluminum, rare earths, and we can enter into intergovernmental commodity agreements through creative international structures to manage trade in those goods. So those are four pathways that we think we can leverage towards designing creative policy approaches in the United States.
Awesome. All right, we've got 11 minutes left. We're going to try to really speed through this. Kelly, do we even care? Like, do people care about the WTO anymore? I mean, people are mixed in their perspectives on that, right? Some people say that the WTO has become ineffective. They look at what China's doing. How should we be thinking about this?
Well, I care. But I would say, I mean, the administration is committed to the WTO. while also recognizing the need for it to adapt to be able to address today's challenges like climate change. And we do view that it's critical to stay engaged with WTO members, 164 countries, soon to be 166, to hear their views and to share ours. And so, there tends to be a misunderstanding around climate and trade and the automatic assumption that if we take actions, these are going to be out of compliance with WTO rules. And Katrina just outlined various issues there. But since this is a rapidly evolving and developing area, it's all the more reason why we need to stay engaged and build an understanding. And so we definitely won't agree on everything. That's impossible. But at least we might find some commonality, which again is the focus of our recent communication. And I would also just say that the WTO is not only a space for negotiations. I mean, look, it took us 20 years to get to a first phase WTO fisheries subsidies agreement. So it takes some time. But it has an important convening power, an important role to play in the transparency space. And so, again, for us, it's really necessary to have the broad-based discussions with a full range of trading partners to understand the different approaches that members are taking because of their different domestic needs. And again, I would also note that the WTO is not the only place that this is happening. We're having discussions in the OECD. We're talking to APEC partners. We're talking bilaterally with our trading partners. We're engaged in various regional initiatives. So, trade and climate is on the agenda in multiple institutions. It is a busy landscape, and we're tracking all of it, which is challenging at times. But the WTO does have an important role to play, so we see that very much.
Thank you. Dan, your boss has a bill. Senator Cassidy on the Republican side, he also has a bill. There's some really key similarities to those bills, and there's some key differences. Right now, there isn't yet a bipartisan bill, even though there's clear bipartisan interest in getting there. Where's this going? How can we get a bipartisan bill? Can we get a bipartisan law enacted? Is that a next month thing, next year thing? Like, what should we be thinking?
You're asking me to take out my crystal ball. Well,
you packed that, right?
Yes. Okay. It just broke on the plane. So, I think
supply chain issues.
I think there's a lot in there. I guess I would say, in terms of the Democratic bill and the Republican bill that have been introduced this Congress, there are a lot of differences, but the big one is, do you do anything domestically? And they do not, and we do. Our view is that you must do something domestically for a variety of reasons. One, and you're hearing this from a Democrat, the IRA is not nearly enough. Anyone who thinks we have solved the climate crisis, at least domestically, via the IRA is deluding themselves. Like, none of the modeling suggests that United States emissions will be reduced anywhere as quickly as they need to be. So we need additional policies that also apply domestically. In terms of outlooks, I think there are a couple things that this policy could have going for it. One is that there is not, obviously, unfortunately, bipartisan consensus on climate. It's like zero. I live this every day. It's deeply frustrating. There is, to the sort of broader purpose of this summit, bipartisan consensus on competition and China issues. And so this is climate policy that can potentially surf a bit on that. But I think the bigger opportunity is, as many of you may know, at the end of next year, so the end of 2025, about $4 trillion worth of tax cuts will expire. It's a big swath of the Trump tax bill that was passed in 2017. Assuming that there is some form of divided government next year, you will likely have Republicans who will say, we want to extend all of it. Maybe we even want to add additional tax cuts to the package. You will have Democrats who will say, we're willing to extend some of it, the stuff that applies to generally individual filers and family filers earning under $400,000. The rest of it, like, if you want to do it, like, we're going to need to see some pay-fors. And so now you have a very different conversation where I think in isolation, Republicans have never met a revenue raiser that they didn't hate. But in the context of trying to pay for other tax cuts, you are now looking at revenue raisers no longer in isolation, but you are looking at them based on their relative merits. And if you have something in the border adjustment space that can also be successfully and truthfully and honestly sold as good competition policy, good China policy, that gives it a leg up compared to, say, raising the corporate rate by 1 or 2%, or closing off loopholes that a lot of companies love, or raising rates on rich people, which, despite their populist turn, Republicans still generally don't want to do. So I think this does have some advantages that other options do not, and I think it also has the advantage that corporations, maybe even fossil fuel companies, would rather do this than see their rates or other loopholes get closed. So I would say don't expect anything to happen this year, and that's really not just on climate, but that's you haven't been paying attention. The House is a bit dysfunctional these days. But next year, depending on how elections go, but assuming some form of divided government, I think at a minimum, with Democrats controlling the House, I think this is something that could be in the mix.
All right, we're getting to the end. I'm going to let everyone do like a 1-minute closing. I'll add in that there is already a bipartisan bill that's related. It's called the Prove It Act, and it gets the data, the comparative data of the U.S. product emissions compared to trading partners' emissions. It's bipartisan, introduced in the Senate. It already passed committee, the EPW committee in the Senate. It's already passed it with a strong bipartisan vote. Optimistic about that. So I'm going to give everyone one chance for a quick 1-minute closing. And Kelly, I'm hoping yours will at least include something on the new White House task force. Let's start with Katrina.
Okay, I won't do task force then. So we've talked a lot about a sort of defensive posture for this policy space. What can the United States do to insulate domestic manufacturers from foreign competition that isn't taking into account the environmental considerations we do here at home? That is a really important part of global decarbonization. It is how we deploy and test and scale the technologies that we're going to need to decarbonize all sorts of applications. We need to do that. But that doesn't address what we started this conversation with, which is the carbon loophole. We simply need to figure out how to export into foreign markets this same interest in valuing goods based on their carbon intensity. And it's not just these sort of import fee kinds of policies that will do that. We need to start thinking about important linkages to markets that can supply the goods we need. How do we work better with them? We need to work with like-minded partners that are similarly climate ambitious. We need to find coherence and interoperability in our policy approaches. And these themes I've heard in all sorts of panels on this stage that have absolutely nothing to do with climate already. This attention to how to use the trade system in a more dynamic way to solve problems is man, it's cool. And I'm happy to be riding the coattails of all these trade geeks. Thank you very much.
Kelly? Less than a minute.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you did ask about the Climate and Trade Task Force. So, I mean, this newly formed task force is an important signal that, we're going to continue to prioritize climate policy, and that this effort will build on a lot of work that's been undertaken the past few years, including the rollout of the IRA incentives that are helping to spur the clean economy and our decarbonization transition. And just to note that, as John Podesta noted in his recent speech when he announced the task force, we need to look at the role of trade and ensure that our trade policies are supporting our climate objectives and certainly not undermining them. And so this means, making some of those policies that are securing the historic investments that we're making domestically, and then help sending the right signals to the market and our trading partners on how we can advance and share these goals. And I think just one really important piece of this is that we're looking at the data very closely. We're looking at the methodologies very closely. This is all about, laying the domestic foundation, but then expanding the circle, out to key trading partners. And that's really going to be important for the task force. It's going to be critical that we develop good data and methodologies, including understanding how different approaches can be interoperable and how different policy choices can lead to the same objectives and have some coherence. And this is really important for spurring our decarbonization objectives, but also facilitating trade when we do so.
Terrific. Mike?
So accounting itself is not that interesting, but accounting is a fair way to be able to demonstrate a company's investments and quality in terms of decarbonizing its products and services. That's a competitive advantage that is imperative for trade. That's a competitive advantage that's necessary for us to harness the market to find opportunities at the Pareto for every organization to decarbonize. That's the only way we're going to get this world on the brink away from the brink. This is the most urgent issue, and we need to act quickly. The only way that we think that will happen is not going to be solely government fiat and government policy, but it's got to be individual entities finding a way forward. We think this is the right approach.
Dan?
I'll echo that urgency. I think we do not have time to waste. So I would say I think that militates a little bit in favor of being a little less picayune about the data and accepting that it's going to be hard and that we're going to have to roll with the punches, but we need to pass policy and implement it. I would also add, I think that the EU CBAM is also a nice forcing mechanism here where US companies will eventually start having to pay tariffs starting in 2026. They're already having to report data. That builds some political momentum to do something. But the bottom line is that I think good intentions and individual will is not enough. We need market signals to decarbonize. Certainly you can do that to a certain extent through subsidies and tax credits, but as long as it's free to pollute, we are not going to get to net zero, and that does require some combination of domestic performance standards, fees, whatever you want to call them, and tariffs.
Well, clearly this policy space is really interesting. It's really intricate. And there's just massive potential for bipartisan policymaking working together and actually accomplishing something in the relatively near term. I'm really optimistic about it. Look forward to talking with all of you about it more. Thank you so much to all of you on the panel, and thank you to Silverado.